The allure of commercial country music frequently rests upon a carefully manufactured illusion of absolute permanence. We, as consumers of modern media, naturally gravitate toward figures who embody an unshakable sense of cultural continuity, viewing them as living monuments rather than vulnerable human beings. Josh Turner has occupied this exact cultural space for over 2 decades, existing as a foundational pillar of traditionalism within an industry that routinely discards its own heritage in pursuit of fleeting contemporary trends. With his instantly recognizable, subterranean bass baritone register and in public image anchored firmly in faith and family values, he presents the picture-perfect portrait of a man who successfully navigated the volatile currents of fame entirely unscathed. Yet beneath this immaculate, highly polished exterior lies a far more complex narrative defined by profound precarity and quiet existential reckonings. When we look past the glittering accolades and the comforting warmth of his radio hits, we begin to discern a trajectory that was nearly derailed before it ever truly found its footing. The trajectory of his existence forces a radical reevaluation of what it actually means to survive the grueling machinery of modern American stardom. Understanding the true nature of his journey requires us to look far beyond the bright lights of Nashville's historic stages, transporting ourselves instead to the quiet rural landscape of Hannah, South Carolina. This wasn't merely a geographic point of origin. It was an entire ecosystem governed by the rhythmic, predictable demands of agricultural life, deep-seated communal ties, and an all-enveloping spiritual devotion. In this isolated pocket of the American South, musical expression wasn't viewed as a potential ladder to immense wealth or global notoriety, but rather as an essential, foundational element of communal survival and collective worship. From his earliest formative years, Turner's identity was thoroughly saturated by the visceral, unadorned power of traditional gospel arrangements. Singing the bass lines in local church choirs and eventually forming a modest gospel quartet known as the Thankful Hearts, he developed an intimate relationship with music as a sacred vessel. There was absolutely nothing transactional or performative about these early endeavors. They represented a pure, unadulterated exploration of vocal harmony rooted in shared belief. This early environment instilled a specific creative philosophy that would permanently govern his career, yet it simultaneously masked the extreme fragility of the path he was destined to tread. The transition from a small-town church singer to a serious contender in the professional music landscape is historically fraught with immense peril, yet the greatest threat Turner faced wasn't industry indifference. In the mid-1990s, while quietly preparing himself for the monumental hurdles of a professional career, an unexpected medical catastrophe threatened to permanently silence his ambitions before the public ever learned his name. The discovery of a severe lesion on his right vocal cord sent shockwaves through his entire world, presenting a terrifying existential crisis that challenged his fundamental identity. For any vocalist, the physical mechanics of the throat represent a delicate, irreplaceable instrument, and even the slightest physiological disruption can instantly shatter a lifetime of aspirations. The specialized medical professionals he consulted faced a critical dilemma, ultimately deciding against a risky surgical intervention that could leave permanent scar tissue on his vocal apparatus. Instead, they prescribed an extraordinarily grueling regimen that required absolute, uncompromising discipline from the young artist. He was ordered to enter a state of total vocal silence for an entire calendar year, an agonizing sentence that forced him to confront the terrifying possibility of losing his primary gift forever. Embracing total silence for 12 consecutive months is a psychological ordeal that few individuals outside the monastic tradition can fully comprehend, particularly an ambitious young artist on the precipice of adulthood. Turner was abruptly forced to retreat from his emerging creative endeavors, returning to the familiar confines of South Carolina not as a triumphant local hero, but as a compromised casualty of circumstance. During this prolonged period of forced isolation, he watched from the agonizing sidelines as the contemporary music industry marched forward without him, utterly indifferent to his personal plight. The psychological toll of this enforced quietude cannot be overstated, as it demanded a systematic dismantling of his ego and an uncomfortable confrontation with his own vulnerability. Without the ability to speak, converse, or sing, he was trapped entirely within the confines of his own mind, left to wonder if his vocal cords would ever regain their resonant power. It is precisely within these unglamorous, agonizing chapters of human isolation that a person's true character is forged, far away from the superficial validation of cheering crowds. Rather than allowing the suffocating weight of uncertainty to paralyze his ambition, he chose to view this catastrophic pause as a profound evolutionary crucible. Instead of succumbing to despair during this year of profound isolation, Turner initiated a meticulous, highly disciplined rebuilding process that transformed his entire understanding of vocal mechanics. He began dedicating his silent hours to the exhaustive study of classical vocal techniques, analyzing the intricate anatomy of breath control, resonance, and physical sustainability. This wasn't merely a passive recovery period. It was a comprehensive, ground-up reconstruction of his artistic vehicle designed to ensure long-term structural integrity. He learned how to manipulate his air support and protect his vocal folds with the precision of an elite athlete, transforming a natural gift into a highly technical craft. In later years, he would frequently offer a light-hearted anecdote about how he mastered the intricate art of whistling during that silent year, a charming detail that underscores his resilient psychological coping mechanisms. Yet, beneath that casual humor lay the reality of a man who had stared into the creative abyss and systematically engineered his own resurrection. When his voice finally returned, it possessed a transformed quality. It was no longer just a raw, unguided force of nature, but a highly disciplined, deeply self-aware instrument capable of enduring immense professional strain. Armed with this newly fortified vocal instrument and a heightened awareness of his own professional mortality, Turner finally made the monumental leap to Nashville, Tennessee. This migration represented a profound shift from the predictable security of his homeland to the hyper-competitive, deeply predatory environment of Music City. He enrolled at Belmont University, an institution widely celebrated for producing elite musical talent, yet his presence there offered absolutely no guarantees of ultimate commercial viability. Nashville in the late 1990s and early 2000s was a city fiercely obsessed with slick, pop-inflected country productions, actively prioritizing high-energy showmanship and crossover commercial appeal. In stark contrast, Turner arrived with an uncompromising adherence to traditional roots music and a deep, rumbling vocal delivery that felt almost archaic to contemporary executives. He did not possess the flashy, attention-seeking charisma that typically captured the imagination of talent scouts, choosing instead to rely entirely on the quiet gravity of his unique sonic presence. This stubborn refusal to adapt to prevailing industry trends was an incredibly risky gamble that could have easily resulted in lifetime obscurity, positioning him as a stubborn relic rather than a bankable star. It was during this intensely uncertain chapter of academic and professional preparation that the foundational emotional anchor of his adult life began to materialize. At Belmont University, he crossed paths with Jennifer Ford, a gifted fellow musician whose artistic sensibility matched his own deep respect for structural discipline and spiritual integrity. Their blossoming relationship was explicitly not characterized by the chaotic, fast-paced romance often romanticized in popular culture, but was instead built upon a shared spiritual foundation and mutual creative respect. They married shortly after completing their studies, establishing a deeply egalitarian partnership that would systematically defy the staggeringly high divorce rates of the entertainment industry. Jennifer chose not to remain a passive observer of her husband's emerging career, instead integrating herself directly into the operational fabric of his touring apparatus as a keyboardist and background vocalist. By weaving their personal and professional lives into a singular, cohesive tapestry, they constructed a formidable psychological shield against the isolating pressures of impending fame. Over the subsequent decades, This union would produce 4 sons, creating a highly stable, tightly knit family unit that served as an essential sanctuary from the superficiality of the commercial music world. Despite possessing a formidable partnership and a highly refined vocal style, Turner's breakthrough into the upper echelons of the country music hierarchy required a singular, transcendent catalyst. That paradigm-shifting moment arrived with deceptive simplicity on the hallowed stage of the Grand Ole Opry, an institution that demands reverence from even the most seasoned performers. Stepping into the legendary circle, the relatively unknown artist performed a composition he had penned himself, a hauntingly allegorical piece titled Long Black Train. Heavily inspired by the sparse, emotionally raw songwriting tradition of Hank Williams, the track utilized the vivid imagery of a locomotive as a metaphor for spiritual temptation and moral choices. What transpired during those brief minutes on stage completely shattered the conventional protocols of the historic venue, catching both executives and audiences entirely off guard. Long before the final notes of the composition could echo through the auditorium, the crowd rose in a spontaneous, deeply visceral standing ovation. This overwhelming display of public validation forced the young singer to halt his performance midstream, completely overwhelmed by the immediate realization that his life had permanently altered course. The sheer magnitude of that debut performance necessitated an exceedingly rare occurrence in Opry history, an immediate, highly demanded encore of an unreleased song by an unsigned artist. As he repeated the haunting verses of Long Black Train to a spellbound audience, the trajectory of modern country music experienced a subtle yet undeniable course correction. This wasn't merely a successful performance. It was a triumphant validation of traditionalism over manufactured pop sensibilities, proving that audiences still hungered for deep, resonant storytelling. The subsequent commercial release of the track catapulted Turner into international prominence, transforming him from a struggling Nashville hopeful into a major industry asset. Yet, as the intoxicating machinery of hyperstardom began to envelop him, he maintained a remarkably disciplined, almost detached attitude toward his newfound fame. He consistently and publicly asserted that his primary identity was defined by his Christian faith rather than his status as a commercial celebrity. This explicit distinction was crucial, as it allowed him to navigate the highly compromising demands of the music industry without sacrificing the core ethical values he had cultivated in the fields of South Carolina. For a prolonged period following his initial breakthrough, Turner's life appeared to achieve a rare, almost mythical equilibrium that eluded the vast majority of his creative peers. He accumulated a string of massive multi-platinum hits, secured prestigious industry awards, and built a massive, fiercely loyal global fan base, all while maintaining his pristine reputation. His professional life was defined by an orderly, highly transparent routine, completely devoid of the public scandals, substance abuse issues, and interpersonal warfare that routinely dominate entertainment headlines. By actively keeping his family by his side on the road, he successfully neutralized the profound isolation that so often degrades the mental well-being of touring artists. To the casual observer, his existence resembled a flawless masterclass in career management and personal fulfillment, a testament to the power of clean living and unshakable faith. This pervasive narrative of absolute stability became central to his public brand, offering fans a comforting symbol of safety in an increasingly chaotic world. However, this profound sense of security ultimately served to heighten the sheer, unadulterated horror of the catastrophic events that were quietly gathering on the horizon. The intrinsic problem with a life defined by pristine order is that it frequently breeds a false sense of immunity to the random, egalitarian cruelties of the physical universe. Tragedy does not consult an individual's moral resume before striking, nor does it respect the carefully constructed sanctuaries of the devout and disciplined. In September of 2019, Turner was deeply engaged in a standard, highly successful concert tour, navigating the familiar rhythms of performance, travel, and rest. He had just completed an emotionally charged, highly celebrated performance at the beautiful Vina Robles Amphitheater, located in Paso Robles, California, for the veteran performer and his seasoned operational team. This was simply another entirely routine assignment, successfully executed in a lifetime full of them. The atmosphere following the show was undoubtedly one of relaxed satisfaction, as the entire organization prepared for an overnight journey to the next scheduled venue. Turner and his core musical band boarded their primary tour bus, while his extensive technical road crew loaded their specialized equipment into a separate transport vehicle. As the caravan departed into the dark California night, no one could have possibly predicted that this mundane separation of vehicles would determine the boundary between life and death. As the midnight hour passed, the technical cruise bus traveled steadily along a notoriously dark and demanding stretch of Highway 46 near the rural community of Shandon. Inside the vehicle, the men and women who formed the invisible backbone of Turner's nightly performances were resting, entirely unaware of the imminent physical catastrophe awaiting them. For reasons that would spark intense technical and forensic investigations for months to come, the heavy vehicle suddenly and violently deviated from its established lane. The physics of a multi-ton tour bus losing control at highway speeds are utterly terrifying, involving immense kinetic energies that human bodies are fundamentally unequipped to withstand. The out-of-control vehicle careened wildly off the asphalt shoulder, tearing through thick roadside vegetation and traveling dozens of yards across open ground with unstoppable momentum. The trajectory led directly to the unseen edge of a steep, unforgiving embankment, where the vehicle momentarily defied gravity before plunging violently into a dry riverbed below. The subsequent impact was a chaotic explosion of twisting metal, shattering glass, and violent deceleration that instantly transformed the interior into a scene of absolute devastation. The sheer physical violence of the impact was so catastrophic that multiple passengers were violently ejected from the vehicle as it crushed itself against the terrain. When the deafening sound of tearing metal finally ceased, a suffocating, horrific silence descended upon the remote, darkness-shrouded riverbed. Emergency first responders who rushed to the scene were confronted with a mass casualty incident of staggering proportions, requiring a massive allocation of regional medical resources. One individual had sustained injuries so profoundly severe that medical intervention was entirely futile, and he was pronounced dead at the immediate scene of the crash. 7 other occupants of the vehicle lay scattered throughout the wreckage, suffering from a terrifying array of major internal and orthopedic traumas. The logistics of the rescue operation were incredibly complex, requiring specialized extrication tools to free the critically injured driver from the crushed cockpit of the bus. Medevac helicopters were scrambled through the night sky to airlift the most unstable patients to regional trauma centers, while a fleet of ambulances rushed others to local emergency facilities. It was a scene of unmitigated, sudden human suffering that immediately shattered the peaceful, routine illusion of the musical tour. In the immediate wake of such a shocking event, investigators aggressively sought to determine the precise underlying cause of the catastrophic structural failure. Initial public speculation naturally centered around the tragic possibilities of driver impairment, a common variable in devastating late-night highway accidents. However, forensic analysis and toxicological screenings quickly and definitively ruled out the presence of alcohol or illicit substances in the driver's system. The investigative focus then systematically shifted toward more insidious potential catalysts, such as a sudden, catastrophic mechanical failure within the braking or steering systems, or an unforeseen medical emergency that incapacitated the operator. Yet, for the survivors trapped in hospital beds and the grieving families absorbing the shock, the technicalities of the accident reconstruction held little comfort. The immutable, agonizing reality of the situation was defined entirely by the profound human loss that could never be repaired by an official police report. The individual who perished in the wreckage was identified as David Turner, a highly gifted and universally respected 64-year-old sound engineer who had spent decades mastering his craft. Though he happened to share a surname with a famous artist he worked for, David Turner was not biologically related to Josh Turner. Yet within the unique culture of the road, that distinction was completely irrelevant. In the insular, intensely demanding universe of live music production, the traditional boundaries that separate employers from employees are systematically eroded by the sheer reality of daily life. The road crew does not merely perform a professional service. They live in intimate, prolonged proximity, sharing meals, sleep cycles, and the intense psychological pressures of delivering flawless performances night after night. They represent a self-contained, fiercely loyal surrogate family that functions far away from the comforts of their respective homes. David Turner was universally regarded as a beloved patriarch within this unique ecosystem, a steady, dependable presence whose technical brilliance was matched only by his generous spirit. He was a devoted husband, a loving father, and a proud grandfather whose entire world extended far beyond the technical audio consoles he operated with such precise skill. His sudden, violent departure left a massive, entirely irreplaceable void in the hearts of everyone who had shared a stage or a highway with him. The emotional horror of this tragedy is significantly compounded when one considers the chillingly narrow margin that separated the survivors from the deceased. Josh Turner and his immediate musical ensemble were traveling a short distance away on a completely separate bus, entirely oblivious to the carnage occurring behind them until notified by authorities. One minor logistical adjustment, one random change in seating arrangements, or a different choice in travel scheduling could have easily placed the star himself inside the doomed vehicle. This terrifying realization, that survival was dictated entirely by blind, unfeeling circumstance rather than divine intervention or personal merit, is a psychologically destabilizing concept to digest. To look back at a smoking wreckage and realize you were spared simply by the spin of a cosmic roulette wheel forces an intense, deeply painful confrontation with one's own mortality. For an individual who had systematically organized his entire life around the concept of purposeful destiny and divine protection, this random distribution of suffering represented a profound psychological shock. Surviving a catastrophe of this magnitude does not mean escaping it. It merely means you are tasked with the agonizing responsibility of bearing witness to the destruction. When Josh Turner finally broke his silence in the days following the catastrophic event, his public communication bore absolutely none of the polished, PR-vetted sterility typical of modern celebrity statements. His words were heavy, visibly strained, and explicitly articulated the profound, paralyzing grief that had completely enveloped his entire organization. He openly admitted to his global audience that he was entirely at a loss for words, struggling to find language adequate to express the sheer depth of the trauma they were experiencing. He didn't attempt to offer easy spiritual platitudes or superficial reassurances, choosing instead to allow the public to see the raw, unedited reality of his broken heart. He framed the loss of David Turner not as an unfortunate operational setback for his business, but as the agonizing passing of a true brother. His public statements also demonstrated an intense, fiercely protective concern for the 7 surviving crew members who remained confined to intensive care units. He explicitly reminded the public that these individuals weren't just names on a news report, but human beings facing an incredibly long, agonizingly painful path toward physical and psychological rehabilitation. In an effort to translate his profound grief into some form of tangible, constructive support, Turner's management team immediately established an official memorial fund dedicated to assisting the victims and their families. This initiative was designed to provide immediate financial relief to the survivors, helping to mitigate the staggering medical expenses and lost wages resulting from the catastrophic crash. It allowed his massive global fanbase to participate directly in the collective mourning process, channeling their collective shock into a practical instrument of communal care. Yet, beneath the necessary logistics of fundraising and public relations, an incredibly intense, deeply private spiritual battle was undoubtedly raging within the artist's soul. Turner had spent his entire adult life publicly testifying to a benevolent, highly protective deity who actively guided the footsteps of the faithful. Confronting a reality where a dedicated, innocent family man is violently crushed to death while returning from doing his job challenges the boundaries of conventional faith. It forces an individual to abandon simplistic, transactional theological frameworks and instead confront the profound, terrifying mystery of human suffering in an imperfect world. The true, unvarnished weight of this tragedy begins to reveal itself not in the immediate, adrenaline-fueled aftermath of the media storm, but in the long, suffocating silence that inevitably follows. The heavy rescue vehicles eventually depart, the shattered highway wreckage is systematically cleared away, and the relentless 24-hour news cycle quickly pivots to the next sensational headline. For the general public, the event rapidly fades into a minor historical footnote, a piece of trivia associated with a popular country music singer. However, for the individuals who actually lived through the trauma, the calendar offers absolutely no easy escape from the lingering emotional echoes. The music industry, governed as it is by immense financial contracts and consumer expectations, does not possess the capacity to pause indefinitely for human mourning. Eventually, the legal obligations must be met, the scheduled tour dates must be rescheduled, and the performance stages must be reconstructed. The terrifying demand to return to normalcy forces a performing artist into an intensely surreal psychological posture, requiring them to sing songs of joy and faith while carrying a heavy heart. When Turner eventually made the difficult decision to step back onto a public stage, the entire nature of his performance had undergone a subtle, deeply profound transformation. There were no dramatic public announcements or overt displays of grief during his sets, as he chose to maintain his characteristic professional restraint and dignity. Instead, the transformation manifested internally, a quiet, pervasive awareness that permanently altered his relationship with his own art form. Every subsequent mile traveled on a tour bus now carried a heavy, unavoidable subtext, a constant physical reminder of the thin line separating safety from disaster. The familiar, rhythmic hum of tires on asphalt, once a deeply comforting soundtrack of professional success, was now permanently linked to the memory of a dark California highway. This is the ultimate, heartbreaking reality of surviving an institutional tragedy. You are forced to return to the exact environment that inflicted the trauma. Turner's enduring journey stands as a powerful, deeply sober reminder that a life built on faith does not grant immunity from the storms of life. It merely provides the internal scaffolding required to keep standing when the ground beneath you completely gives way.